Good evening, my friends. Tonight we are going to talk about the softening of antinatalism and those attempting to domesticate antinatalism from within for personal gain, like dinner party invites. They encourage a culture that produces death. That is the culture they align with, death. Holy shit! Observe the structure carefully, Pinky, because once seen, it becomes difficult to unsee. The contradiction is not a minor inconsistency tucked away in a footnote. It is architectural. If one asserts that procreation is not morally justified, then one has already issued a judgment that carries implications beyond the isolated act. Moral judgments are not decorative. They are not ornaments to be admired and then ignored. They are commitments that constrain what follows. If the act is unjustified, then the network of norms, incentives, expectations, and narratives that normalize, encourage, and reward that act inherits the same defect. You do not get to carve the conclusion out of reality and preserve it in a sterile container while leaving the surrounding system untouched. That is not analysis. That is intellectual taxidermy. The living problem is replaced with a preserved specimen that can be displayed without affecting anything. Consider the machinery involved. Family norms that present reproduction as the natural progression of a life. Cultural scripts that equate parenthood with fulfillment, maturity, or success. Economic structures that assume generational replacement as a background constant. Social rituals that celebrate the decision and stigmatize deviation. Each component contributes to converting what should be a morally evaluated choice into a near-default behavior. The individual decision is not made in a vacuum. It is shaped, nudged, framed, and rewarded by a system that treats it as expected. To condemn the act while defending or excusing the system is to engage in a kind of philosophical double-entry bookkeeping. The liability is acknowledged in one column and then quietly neutralized in another. The ledger appears orderly. The underlying contradiction remains intact. Now examine the maneuver that follows, because it is as reliable as it is evasive. The weak antinatalist begins with an ethical claim. For a brief moment, the argument has coherence. There is recognition of asymmetry, acknowledgement of harm, admission that the act lacks justification. Then the implications begin to accumulate, and with them, discomfort. At this point, the framework shifts. Not announced, not argued, simply enacted. Ethics yields to sociology. The language changes register. We are told that parents are influenced, that society encourages reproduction, that people act with good intentions. Each statement is descriptively accurate. None addresses the normative question. Explanation answers why a behavior occurs. Ethics asks whether it should occur. When explanation is allowed to function as a substitute for justification, the system is not defended through argument, but absolved through narration. One tells a sympathetic story and mistakes understanding for permission. This transition is not accidental. It serves a purpose. By reframing the discussion in terms of causes rather than justifications, the pressure of the ethical claim is diffused. Responsibility is redistributed across a network of influences, and the act itself becomes less sharply defined. It is no longer a discrete imposition to be evaluated, but a product of circumstances to be understood. The result is a softening of judgment, without any corresponding argument that the act is, in fact, justified. The conclusion is not overturned. It is diluted. Then comes the intention shield, which operates with remarkable efficiency. Parents are presented as benign actors guided by instinct, tradition, and hope. Their motivations are humanized, contextualized, rendered sympathetic. This is not false. It is also not relevant to the justification question. Good intentions explain behavior. They do not confer moral permission. If the standard for acceptability is reduced to, "they meant well," then the threshold collapses. Nearly any widespread harm can be defended under that criterion. History provides an extensive catalog of well-intentioned actions that produced suffering on a large scale. The presence of intention does not transform an imposition into a justified act, particularly when the imposition involves exposing another being to non-consensual risk for ends that are not necessary for that being. The intention shield redirects attention from the act to the actor, from the consequences to the motives, and in doing so, it sidesteps the central issue. Following this, the defense of the system reappears, now dressed in the language of pragmatism. One hears that the system is what exists, that society depends on it, that one must operate within reality. These claims are presented as sober acknowledgments of constraint. In practice, they function as a form of intellectual anesthesia. Pragmatism, properly understood, concerns the selection of actions given certain constraints. It does not determine what is justified. When pragmatism is invoked without ever returning to the question of justification, it becomes a means of avoiding the conclusion rather than engaging with it. The argument is not resolved. It is suspended. One continues to defend or excuse the system while never providing a justification for the underlying act. The ethical claim remains nominally intact, but it no longer governs anything. There is also a reputational calculus operating beneath the surface. Positions are not adopted in a vacuum. They exist within social contexts where certain views carry costs. Defending parents and the broader system preserves social legibility. It allows one to articulate a critical stance while signaling that one remains within acceptable bounds. The individual is not cast as extreme, not excluded from ordinary discourse, not subjected to the full weight of social resistance. This produces a form of moral hedging. The conclusion is retained in a weakened form to maintain intellectual credibility, while its implications are softened or ignored to maintain social viability. The result is a position that appears balanced, but is, in fact, non-committal. It demands little and yields less. At the center of this configuration lies a more fundamental driver: desire. The desire for a child, for continuity, for participation in a socially validated narrative. Rather than subject this desire to scrutiny, the framework is adjusted to accommodate it. The ethical claim is not explicitly rejected. It is modified, qualified, surrounded by mitigating considerations until it no longer constrains behavior. One arrives at a position in which procreation is acknowledged as unjustified in principle, yet defended, excused, or even contemplated in practice. This is not a synthesis of competing values. It is a reconfiguration of the argument to reduce internal tension. The conclusion is edited to fit the preference. If one removes the layers of cushioning, the structure resolves into a simple fork. If procreation is unjustified, then defending the act and the system that produces it requires an additional argument, explaining why unjustified actions and their enabling structures deserve protection. Without such an argument, the defense reduces to sympathy, social convenience, or personal inclination. There is, admittedly, a narrow, coherent position available. One may understand the forces that lead individuals to reproduce. One may acknowledge the difficulty of resisting those forces. One may even express a measured compassion for individuals operating within that system. What one cannot do without contradiction is move from understanding to exoneration. To say that an act fails the justification test and then defend the practice as though that failure has no consequences is to sever the conclusion from its implications. What emerges from this pattern is not a robust ethical position, but a comfort-first variant. The language of critique is retained. The substance is diluted. The individual can speak as though they recognize the problem while continuing to defend or participate in the structures that sustain it. The position functions as a kind of accessory. It signals awareness without imposing alignment. It allows one to engage in ethical discourse without accepting the costs that such discourse might entail if taken seriously. And so the system remains intact, Pinky. Not because it has been justified, not because its critics have been refuted, but because those who glimpse the problem decline to follow it to its conclusion. They pause at the edge, note the depth, and then step back into the familiar, carrying with them a softened version of the insight that no longer threatens anything. The contradiction persists, elegantly unresolved, maintained not by argument, but by the quiet refusal to let the argument matter. And then, once the position has been softened to the point of near harmlessness, something even more revealing happens. The pressure doesn't disappear. It gets redirected. Instead of confronting the contradiction within their own framework, these self-proclaimed antinatalists turn outward and begin policing, fragmenting, and undermining those who refuse to dilute the argument. The pattern is depressingly consistent. The most vocal advocates, the ones who actually follow the logic to its conclusion and state it plainly, become the problem, not because their reasoning has been refuted, but because their clarity is inconvenient. So the attack shifts from substance to framing. They are labeled extreme, unhinged, bad for the movement. Notice what's missing: an engagement with the core argument. It's far easier to discredit the messenger than to answer the question they're forcing onto the table. If you can convince the audience that the speaker is socially unacceptable, you never have to deal with what they're saying. This is where smear and division enter as tools of self-preservation. By carving out a respectable version of antinatalism, these actors create distance between themselves and the implications they're unwilling to own. They position themselves as the reasonable middle, the safe interpreters, the ones who can translate the idea without alienating people. In practice, this often means stripping the position of its ethical force and then portraying anyone who refuses that dilution as a liability. It is less a disagreement about truth and more a disagreement about comfort thresholds. But instead of admitting that, it gets reframed as a moral or strategic failing on the part of the more direct advocates. There is also a subtle inversion at work. The individuals who maintain internal consistency are accused of harming the cause, while those who weaken the argument are cast as its responsible stewards. The logic is backwards but effective. It reassures the audience that the problem lies not in the difficulty of the argument, but in the tone of those presenting it. Once that narrative takes hold, the community fractures along lines that have nothing to do with the validity of the position and everything to do with social palatability. The result is a movement that spends more energy managing its own image and internal disputes than advancing or defending its core claims. At bottom, this behavior is not about advancing antinatalism, it is about containing it. By attacking the most uncompromising voices, they reduce the perceived range of acceptable positions and keep the discourse anchored in something socially tolerable. It functions as a kind of internal regulation, ensuring that the argument never becomes sharp enough to seriously challenge the surrounding norms. And so, the cycle continues. The position is acknowledged, softened, defended, and then those who refuse the softening are isolated, not because they are wrong, but because they are unwilling to make the argument comfortable. So in the end, nothing has actually been resolved. The argument isn't defeated, it's domesticated, filed down, made presentable, stripped of anything that might force a real confrontation. The system remains untouched, the act remains unjustified, and the people who point that out too clearly are treated as the problem. And that's where we leave it. The argument is still standing, the contradiction still intact, and the performance of reasonable compromise doing exactly what it was designed to do: nothing. Thanks for watching. If you made it this far, you're either unusually patient or unusually curious. Either way, that already puts you ahead of most.